Keeping It Real. I'm Jay. I just wanted to come in and make a video today and talk about the word that's in the media and in my plugging up my Twitter feed and my Facebook feed, and that's the word appropriation. We see this all the time as Indigenous people, appropriation. We see it with kids having parties, we see it in sports teams, we see it at the Walmart and the dollar store, we see it at the Michaels at the craft store, whether it's dream catchers or any of the things of the like, headdresses. It's in the media all the time. I just want to come in and talk about that a little bit today because I think from a Canadian standpoint, you see a real lack of understanding. People just don't understand appropriation. They don't understand what it means. And from a European mindset, we have to understand that the European way of life is based on appropriation. For 1,000 years, they've been appropriating other people's cultures, other people's foods, other people's language. And so they don't have the slightest idea why there's a backlash against appropriating Indigenous items and icons and imagery at all. So when you look at the Europeans, they have, they've been using the Silk Road and the spice trade since the time of the Romans. For them, this is what it is. And so when they look at our cultural items, whether they're Métis or First Nations, whether they're sashes or they're dream catchers, even, or even our food items, what's more French than poutine? But poutine is based on a potato, and potato is from South America. So, that's how it is. What's more American than cornbread? But where does corn come from? These aren't European cultural items. It's not European foodstuffs. These are Indigenous foodstuffs. And so the Europeans don't have a real concept of appropriation or why it's not appropriate to appropriate. So they are very comfortable in doing these kinds of things because that is their culture, that's their way of life. So to not appropriate or to say that appropriation has limits or boundaries, this is offensive to them because their entire culture and way of life is based on this fact. So for them, it's a very hard concept to even wrap their brain around. So much so that when you see this come up in media, their first reaction to the pushback from Indigenous people on cultural appropriation is to try to put Indigenous people back in the 1800s or pre-contact of saying, well, if we can't appropriate your culture, surely you can't appropriate European cultures and European technologies. You can't appropriate the cell phone or electricity. That was all invented by Europeans. Well, that's a misnomer completely. That's like saying, well, then you can't eat, as if you're not Indigenous, you shouldn't be eating cornbread and you shouldn't be eating pumpkins and squash and you shouldn't be eating, potatoes and French fries. Your food, if you're a European settler, your foodstuffs should really go back to the 1400s as well. So you should only eat culturally European foods from the 1400s. Well, that's as idiotic, right? Let's get real. That's not how the world works. That's not how the world's developed. It's the same thing. Every time you go to the lake or the river and you see some guy in a canoe, should you run up to him and say, hey, are you Indigenous? Or, because the canoes are Indigenous and only Indigenous people should have canoes. So your mode of transportation, your mode of fishing should go back to the 1400s too. So these concepts are ludicrous. And the fact that people feel that they can hide behind their keyboards and be social warriors and spout off these, insulting things that Indigenous people are somehow, to be authentically Indigenous, need to be, regulated back to the 1400s. We should all live in teepees and, do those kinds of things. Now, me personally, I like that idea. I'm all for it. If that means you're going to give me the land back to do it. If you're going to give me the rivers back that I can go canoe and fish in, I'm happy to live in a teepee or my wigwam or whatever you want that's going to make you happy. I'm happy to make a Métis cabin and go live in the woods if you're going to give the land back to me to do it. If you're going to give me the plains back to hunt the buffalo, well, I'm all for going back to it. I'll be happy to do it with a musket or a bow and arrow. I'm good. But for the majority of the people that live in our society today, that's simply not an option because the settler society that has confiscated and appropriated not only our cultural items and our way of life, but largely all of our land and all of our resources that go along with it. So it's a part and parcel package, even when it comes to language. The settler state at large, the Europeans have come here and they say, well, how Indigenous are you if you don't speak your own language? Well, that's a very funny statement to me too, because the federal government funds the learning of English language to about $11 per student. so that kids going to school today can properly learn the English language. Now, sadly, in our society today, Indigenous languages only receive about $3 per student to learn Indigenous language. So even though we as Indigenous people pay taxes to the Canadian state, that we pay the GST, we pay income tax and all other forms of taxation, our kids don't get funded to learn our languages the same as European students get to learn their language. So even in the Canadian state, when the official language is English, those students receive $11. If you're French, you get to receive $24. And if you're Indigenous, you get to receive $3. So keeping our culture in our own country and in our own lands is negated because of this ongoing appropriation of our lands, of our resources, and basically our way of life. And they want us to be consumable because the European society is based on consumerism. I'll do another video later talking about pre-contact Europe and why the model of Canadian society is based on that. But the reality is today that the Europeans that are here in Canada don't understand cultural appropriation at all, because European culture is the culture of appropriation. And I think that's important to understand. And if you're going to get on Facebook and social media and start to talk about why it's okay for these places to sell dream catchers and other cultural items that are particular to Indigenous people, and you don't see the problem with that, I would suggest the problem is in effectively the fact that the European culture is based on appropriation. Europeans, by definition, whether it was spices from India, silk from the Silk Road, coming from Asia, it doesn't really matter. It was all there for the taking and all there for consumption, without any connection to the intrinsic value of the production of those items. There weren't Europeans involved in the growing of spices in India. They only consumed them from the locals. There wasn't Europeans learning the silk trade in Asia. So they have no connection to the production value of those items any more than they do here in North America. They have no production value. When it came to harvesting the buffalo, when it came to harvesting the fish in the rivers, when it comes to wild rice in the lakes, there's no production value to the European society. It's only there for the consumption, which is why these things have largely become extinct. And why we've overforested, why we have hunted the buffalo to the way we have, and all these other things. So I wanted to come in here and make a video today to talk about that the European culture is the culture of appropriation, and that when we get on social media and we talk about why that's wrong, we get such a pushback is because the very concept to the European mindset is completely foreign. So there you go. I'll let you leave you with that today. So I'm Jay. Hope you liked the video. Hit the like button below. Subscribe to the channel. Stay tuned. We'll be coming out with another Impact episode soon. We're going to be showcasing a regrowth forestry block that's about 10 years old. So stay tuned for more episodes and more to come from our channel. In the meantime, keep it real.